By now, many of us know Saladin a lot. Saladin is not only a valued speaker here at UUEA, but he's also the lead educator for our Jubilee Kids program. My honest opinion, he's one of the more impressive people I've ever met. What you may not know yet is that Saladin authored 23 books. He is the Director of Community Engagement at Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center, Public Art Project Coordinator at the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area, a member of the United Nations International Civil Society Working Group for the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, and founding director of the Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters. In today's program, we will examine the legacy of whiteness in America, the role of Upstanders, and the importance of centering Black voices. Saladin, you may have the podium.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, if you would have kept talking, my head would have been so big, I would have walked out of that door. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate just having this type of opportunity to show up authentically myself. You know, as a Black person, a lot of us tend to code switch a lot, where we get around groups of white folks and we change up the way that we talk or how we behave. And I'm thankful to be living in a space and working in a professional space where I authentically am myself. I do not code switch. So that is to say, what I'm going to share with you today is coming directly from here. It's not going to be something tiptoeing around conversations, and some of it is going to be a little uncomfortable too, right? Because these are the type of conversations that we typically don't have on Sunday mornings, right? Usually even in Black churches, we're not having these type of conversations on Sunday mornings. So I'm thankful to have this opportunity to be here, to be able to share this subject matter, right? So I'm going to start off, and I think it's important to set a foundation in terms of basic definitions, right? You can go to the next slide. So bias, right? Bias is a known inner judgment in favor of or against something conscious or voluntary. And this could be positive or negative, right? Like I'm pretty biased of this type of yogurt that I get from Canada, and it's a Greek yogurt that I love. They only make it in Canada, and I would deliberately go across to Canada just to get that yogurt, right? They don't sell it at Wegmans or nothing like that. So all of us have bias in some type of way. It could be positive or negative. And we also have implicit bias, which are unknown inner judgments, right? So for example, I know some brothers, AKA Black men, that may say that they're colorblind, right? And color doesn't mean anything, and you know, they don't see color. But if you look at their dating history for like the last 20 years, like they've consistently chosen non-Black women, right? And if you bring that to their attention, oh no, it's just, I don't see color. But it's like, well, you're kind of like making some involuntary decisions because, you know, these are women that don't live in your community. They're not in your family. They don't work in the same environment as you. So you're making some type of consistent decisions, but you may just not be aware of it, right? I was talking to my oldest daughters recently, and they were telling me that in terms of women who's consistently been in my life, they said that I have a certain type of woman that I'm interested in. They said I have something for crazy women or something. I don't know. But if you ask me personally, like I wouldn't say that, but it's just something that is, I guess, involuntary or implicit. So all of us have implicit bias too, right? Next slide, please. Stereotypes, a widely held idea of a person, place, or thing, and it's typically learned. Like, you know, we learn that, you know, women are into like tall, dark, handsome men, and that has some truth to it, I could tell you from personal experience. But it also is a very stereotype that in a lot of ways may not be true, right? And all of us have certain type of stereotypes, right? Maybe a month or so ago, we had like a potluck dinner, and I'm gonna tell you, when I came in and I looked at the soup, I was wondering if it was gonna be seasoned, you know, or is it gonna be a different type of like white people soup, right? But I tried it and I'm like, oh, okay, this is good, right? So that's a stereotype that I brought into this space, right? And that's something that we all are subject to, right? Next slide, please. Prejudice, inner negative judgment without knowledge of that person, place, or thing, and that is also learned. You know, so we all have prejudices, We all prejudge something to begin with, right? I know you saw some of the news with some of the moves that the Bills have made. And some of us saw that and we prejudged what that's going to look like next season. And we really don't know for a fact what is going to be the outcome of that. So all of us are subject to prejudice. Next slide, please. Discrimination, the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things. And now we're getting into an area where we're talking about power and influence. Like everyone doesn't necessarily have the ability to discriminate, right? For example, some of the nightclubs downtown Buffalo, there's a big list when you go to some of these clubs and it says no hats, no Jordan sneakers, no braids, no thick nostrils where you're gonna breathe most of the air in this environment, like just a whole bunch of just crazy descriptions. And it's no different than some of the signs that we've seen years ago where they just were up front and said no Chinese people, no Jewish people, no women, no black people, right? But it's kind of changed a little bit, but it's the same type of thing to discriminate against specific groups of people, right? Next slide. Racism, the systemic and institutionalized misuse and abuse of power, and I bolded power, right? Because a lot of times people think, oh, black people could be racist too. Well, I don't know, maybe in an African country or something like that, where that represents the dominant masses of people. But in a place where you have a segment of the population that literally has no power in terms of controlling the economy or the institutions or the resources, they don't necessarily have that ability to misuse and abuse power, right? But when you're in an environment where you have people who are connected to institutions and are connected to controlling resources and an economy, you can see those abilities to create racism, sexism, ageism, all of the isms, right? But it's always connected to people in positions of power, or it's from an institutionalized perspective, right? Next slide, please. So when you look at it, bias, implicit bias, prejudice, stereotype, that can be individualized, right? All of us have those different type of things that are going on in us, whether it's positive or negative. But then when you get into discrimination and racism, you're talking more of a group concept, right? Where we're talking about positions of power and influence. And they utilize those positions of power and influence to carry out stereotypes or prejudices or bias or implicit bias. Next slide. So where did whiteness come from? Next slide. So these are old pages from Virginia Assembly law that was passed in 1691. It was called the Suppression for the Outlying of Slaves. And I always show people this because this was the first time that white or whiteness was codified in a legal context. Now what I mean by that is people kind of colloquially use the word white, but it wasn't codified in a legal document yet until 1691. Next slide. And this, on April 1691, Virginia's General Assembly passed the Act of Suppressing Outlying Slaves, granting county sheriffs, their deputies, and any other lawful authority the ability to kill any enslaved person resisting, running away, or refusing to surrender themselves when ordered to do so. This is the first time that the word white was used and codified in a legal document. So when slavery first started in this country, it wasn't as organized as we saw it become in generations. Initially, people had to kind of figure out how to regulate things. And one of the first things that they noticed is they had to figure out how to regulate enslaved people who were off of the plantation. As long as you're on a plantation, we can actually control you and your comings and goings. But once you're outside of the parameters of a plantation, like we don't really have the ways to regulate that. And one of the things that started to become a real issue is miscegenation. Enslaved people forming relationships with other people outside of the parameters of the boundaries of the plantation. So this is why they actually created this law, right? Next slide. Part of the law actually says, and for the prevention or abominable mixture and spirituous issue which herefore may increase in this dominion, as well as by Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians intermarrying with English or other white women, and this is when it was first used in the context of a woman, a white woman, as by their unlawful accompanying with one another, be it enacted by the authority as foresaid, and it is hereby enacted, that for the time to come, whosoever English or other white man or woman, being free, shall intermarry with the Negro, mulatto, or Indian, or woman bond or free, shall within 3 months after such marriage be banished. That's a harsh word, banished, right? And removed from dominion forever, right? So this is the first time when you're thinking about whiteness, how it's actually being defined within the context of relationships, right? And here's the problem. Any of you who define yourself as white, this is something that you all inherited, just like I inherited just the idea of what it means to be black. It's not any of our fault individually or personally right now, but it is our responsibility in order to redefine what that actually is, or even if we want to use it, right? Next slide, please. An act for suppressing outlying slaves was rooted in restricting race mixing and punishing white people for participating in it. They were banished from the colonies forever. If a white woman had a child she was forced to pay 15 pounds of silver to the church. If she defaulted, she would be a servant to the church for 5 years and then sold. So that's a nice way of saying you enslaved too, white woman, right? The child would be enslaved to the church for 30 years. So when they're using the word church, these are not churches that are extinct today. This is a legacy of churches that still exist to this day, but they're not having this conversation Sunday morning, right? Matter of fact, they're probably never having that type of conversation because that is their legacy, right? But this is how that idea of miscegenation was being treated, and they had to regulate that right from the beginning. But that set into motion many other aspects of what we started to see in this country. Books begin to get written, right? Fanning those flames. You saw other books down the line that were written as well. Next slide, please. And then when you saw the harshness or the legacy of slavery, the image that you see up in the left-hand corner is called the pear, like pear fruit, of anguish. And that was a torture device. And I want you to use your imagination of how that was actually used, right? This other device that you see behind it, it would be strapped around a person's head, and that metal part would be stuck inside of their mouth so they couldn't speak. At the top is a cartoon that was drawn, and it was supposedly done to strive to make fun of abolitionists, because in the West Indies, there was, at a parliamentary meeting, there was an abolitionist that spoke about the type of torture that was used against enslaved people. And one of the things that they said on record is that an enslaver actually boiled an enslaved person in a vat of boiling sugar cane. And in order to make light of that, this cartoon was drawn to make it look like, yeah, that's not true. They're exaggerating. You know how these abolitionists just be making stuff up, right? And then down here, in the two images that you see with the red, I just saw those 2 days ago. I was in Jamaica, and I was visiting there, and I was like, oh, I got to bring that back and show, the people some of the things that I've been actually documenting as well. This is actually called a body cage. And what enslavers would do is put a person in that cage where they cannot move and keep them out into the public. And it was used as a warning for anybody else that wanted to actually strive to thwart the authority of enslavers. But that didn't stop black people in Jamaica. Within 7 years, they had over 685 uprisings where they burned plantations, right? So that didn't deter people from resisting, that type of system of slavery. Next slide, please. And this is something that was also popular. Black children as alligator bait was used in American popular culture in the 19th and 20th centuries and were present in a wide array of media, newspapers, reports, songs, sheet music, visual art. This was like popular culture during that time period. Like, why would you use children for alligator bait? Right? It's funny, when you look at like directors or people who write horror movies, they're usually never black people that write horror movies, right? Because a lot of times we didn't have to try to come up with some creative way in terms of striving to depict death as an art, right? It's something that a lot of us actually lived through, and it wasn't fiction for us. Next slide, please. And this is important because D.W. Griffin, I'm not sure if any of you ever seen this film. It's called Birth of a Nation, subtitled The Klansman. And this is a film that was celebrating the Ku Klux Klan. So some of the things that I showed you the period between the 1800s, and now we're moving into the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, we have this film that was actually produced. And it's celebrating the Klan. The reason that you see the two white women in the middle is because the Klan, their whole idea was to protect the purity of the race. And who do you have to protect? You got to protect our women, right? Next slide, please. This film was screened at the White House in 1915. Screened at the White House. This is a quote from Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at that time. He said, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a venerable empire of the South to protect the Southern country." Right? So this film portrayed black characters, they were white actors with blackface, as ignorant and sexually aggressive. Now, you see the connection with that type of caricature being created about black men during the time periods of enslavement, right? That same narrative has been consistently advocated for generations. Aggressive towards white women, the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, is portrayed as a historic force necessary to preserve American values, protect white women, and maintain white supremacy. So this is the foundation when you're talking about the early 1900s. By the time you get to the 1930s, you have 3 million card-carrying members of the KKK throughout North America, right? Next slide, please. And this created what is known as Negrophobia, the fear of black men, right? And you also started to see lynchings that became like a pastime here in America, right? Where people would actually send postcards for lynchings. And when people were lynched, body parts, and I want you to use your imagination, body parts were actually severed from victims and kept as keepsakes, right? And this is a part of American history. Next slide, please. So where did race come from? One of the codifications of race can be traced back to this white anthropologist named Ernest Elbert Houghton. So when I say white anthropologist, I'm talking about people who oftentimes didn't really have a deep scientific background, who were looking at studying the human family and things from an objective perspective. I'm talking about people who were traveling places to fill their cabinets of curiosity so that when people came over for dinner parties, they can pull out this and say, look, I got this monkey hand from over in this country, right? I'm not talking about actual scientists. It eventually evolved into an actual science, but I'm talking about people who had wealth and they traveled and they found little nice things to bring home and put in their cabinets. But this guy, in addition to helping establish Harvard as a center for physical anthropology in the United States, he was responsible for classifying human beings into groups and subgroups based upon phenotype, just physical appearance, through what is called comparative anatomy. Houghton used white people as a primary model of a man and classified and defined black and brown people as primitives according to this basic standard. Based upon Houghton's words, in 1926, the American Association of Physical Anthropology and the National Research Council organized a committee to focus on the anatomy of black people, so-called Negroes at the time. A year later, in 1927, The committee endorsed a comparison of African babies with young apes. If that wasn't enough, about 10 years later, in 1937, the committee published findings in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology to prove, not suggest or to imply, that Negroes were closer to primates than the white race. Right? So now, because this person is operating in this professional space or this industry, who's going to debate them? Right? So you started to see not only, like I showed you originally, the codification of what white is, now you're starting to see this concept of white supremacy being saturated into every aspect of society, right? So when you look at that act for suppressing the outlying of slaves in 1691, that's 85 years before this country started. So this is the foundation of this country being started. So when you hear people talking about, oh my God, America wasn't founded on racism. What? What you talking about? You obviously have not been researching or studying, right? Next slide, please. So because of this, you started to see black resistance movements that began to develop for change in every aspect of society. And this was the response to what we started to see, right? Some of the people that you see up here, you see Nina Simone. She did it in the form of music. You see Paul Robeson. He did it as a thespian, as an actor, but also an activist. You see Oscar Micheaux. He was a film director, right? Martin Luther King, Noble Drew Ali, the father of Allah who started the 5% Nation. Elijah Muhammad, anybody familiar with Elijah Muhammad? He's one of the first people that just straight up called white people the devil. And people did not debate him or challenge him publicly and say, no, you're not, no. This is in the early 1930s when he started the movement of the Nation of Islam, and one of the foundations were white people are devils, right? Because imagine what he was seeing. Like I said, by that time period, you have lynching that is something that is normal in this society, right? And you have over 3 million card-carrying members of the KKK throughout North America. This is the environment that he's growing up in. So that was his conclusion, right? And we need to have a separate land for ourselves so that we don't have to live under this terrorism, right? Fannie Lou Hamer, she was an advocate as well for workers' rights. You have the Black Panther Party. All of these movements were the response of what was happening during that time period, right? Next slide, please. So what was happening is you move from that time period of enslavement, and then you get into segregation or legal apartheid here in this country, and black people are being attacked from all fronts. In the banking industry, you can't get loans, right? And if you do get a loan, the loan officer looked just like that. I mean, nowadays they don't wear hoods, but you know, that's how it oftentimes looks. The criminal justice system, public health, education, and keep in mind that when you have black people who are technically citizens or paying taxes to, but the money that they're paying those taxes to is not going back into their communities. It's not building their schools or providing them with resources and access to public goods like everybody else. It's going outside of their communities, right? Next slide. And then you have a person like Samuel Gompers. He was the first and longest serving president of the American Federation of Labor, the most influential labor federation in the world. And in the early 1900s, he franchised union discrimination and employment terrorism against BIPOC people, black, especially people who come from Asian countries like Japan and China, and especially in those building trades and construction trades, with the government's approval and funding. And that is a monument in Washington, D.C. right now that you can go and actually look at. Next slide, please. You have redlining that was going on, where again, people couldn't get homes and live in certain communities. You also had sundown towns. So those kind of worked hand in hand. You had some community members that was like, okay, we're gonna kind of figure out a crafty way to redline you. You had other ones like, yo, don't be in these city limits when the sun go down, right? Next slide, please. And then you're being attacked at the same time from the media aspect. And these are cartoons that depict black people. You had advertisements depicting black people. And this goes from the first time advertisement began all the way to today in 2024, right? So constantly under attack. Next slide, please. So I always ask the question when people say this, like, what era was great in America? Especially for me. America's only 247 years old, but slavery lasted 89 years in terms of the birth of this country. But keep in mind that before 1776, you already had 5 generations of enslavement on the land. Then slavery became the law, and that lasted for 87 years. But then you had legal apartheid, segregation, for another 101 years. So that equals 188 years that black people were considered slaves, less than, and every other thing besides an equal citizen in this country, which means 76% of the time America has existed, black people were legally restricted from participating in it, right? And I know that, you know, we may see Jay-Z and Beyonce and some of these other millionaires, and it may look like they represent us as a group. No. No, when you actually look at the data statistically, as a group, black people are no farther along socioeconomically than we were in the 1800s. Right. Next slide, please. This is something also interesting. After World War I, you had soldiers who were coming back from the war, and they were what was known as shell-shocked at the time. But shell-shocked eventually became redefined as post-traumatic stress disorder. And because of that, people begin to see how that affected their livelihood and their quality of life, right? Where they begin to see a decreased quality or access to health care, you know, for veterans. Psychological symptoms, negative coping behaviors. Many people became addicted to substances, right? Substance abuse. Physical health outcomes, cardiovascular disease, decreased birth weight in children, increased blood pressure, physical injury. All of these things were recognized from soldiers coming back from war, right? And it was clear to be able to see those type of effects of how a war zone would impact people. Next slide, please. But these are the exact same things you would see with enslaved people. The exact same things, right? Because an enslaved person is in a war zone. These are prisoners of war, right? They're living under domestic terrorism in this country. And if you're living under these conditions for generations, that is being passed on to the next generation moving forward. And then when slavery ended in 1863 on paper, because you can't legislate people's attitudes, when it ended on paper in 1863, you remember that great program that the government created to address like the post-traumatic stress for enslaved people? No. No. It wasn't offered to enslaved people, and it was not offered to enslavers. And that is even something to even think about. Because the fact that people were able to create this type of system and to be looked at as a standard of normacy, what? And not be psychologically evaluated or even addressed, is something to think about, right? So next slide, please. So we have to talk about the white privilege card, because we can't have this conversation without addressing this, right? And to be clear, white privilege is not, and I put it in bold, is not the suggestion that white people have never struggled. White privilege is a built-in advantage separate from one's level of income or effort. Now, as white men, you have a little bit more white privilege than white women, to be clear. It is having greater access to economic and institutional power and resources than BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, who people do who are in the same situation, right? Next slide, please. And here's some examples of white privilege. Number one, the privilege of historically having a better relationship with police. Keep in mind that the first police forces were organized in Boston, and they stem from slave patrols, night riders, and night watchmen to protect the property. And keep in mind, black people were considered property, to protect the property of those who actually own things. So the privilege to connect to that relationship and have that with law enforcement is something that is a privilege. The privilege of being favored by school authorities and historically attending segregated schools of affluence. The privilege of learning about whiteness in school as the standard perspective of all subjects. Now that's something that a lot of times people don't take in consideration. When you're learning any of the subjects in school, usually it's being taught from the perspective of some benevolent white person that came up with this idea or came up with this invention or whatever. It's not really told from my perspective, right? And because of that, that is a privilege to go to school and to learn and to have access to these type of perspectives that usually is not taken into consideration the other type of perspectives of other people. The privilege of finding books, television programs, films, radio stations, or music, advertisements, resources, and even religious icons. That's what I like about this space too, because I don't got to come in here and see a bunch of white Jesus. You know? Icons that are white as a standard of intelligence, beauty, benevolence, and power, right? It's kind of like sometimes I may look through books, and especially for my daughter, you know what I'm saying? I specifically buy her dolls that look like her. I specifically buy books that reflect her and other people, right? Because I know that we live in a society where her perspective, her sense of esteem, her sense of confidence is not something that is considered the standard or the status quo. So I have to do extra and be intentional about making sure that her identity is reinforced. You know, and that's also the kind of household that I grew up in, right? The privilege to say you don't see color. I cannot say that. Historically, my people saying something like that could mean you're going to lose your life. I need to know the landscape. You know, think about those of us who were part of the Underground Railroad. You did not have the luxury of just saying, I don't see color. You will not make it. You needed to know what white person was an abolitionist and what person was faking like they was an abolitionist. What community you need to go to and what community you need to avoid. So you had to actually be aware of that. But many people, they can just grow up like, oh, I don't see color, because it really doesn't affect them like that. My survival depends on that, right? The privilege to diminish, discredit, disbelieve, or never think any further about anything that I'm saying today. Why black people's very survival has historically depended upon knowing who white people are. Right? All of you could just walk right out of here, oh my God, that was great, and never think about anything else that I'm saying. I have to think about this. It doesn't mean that, you know, I'm walking around paranoid or something like that, but many of us are. Many of us literally are crazy out of our minds because we live in a society where everybody's telling us what you feel and what you see is not real. You have a personal problem and you need to get on some type of medication to address the psychological issues that you're dealing with. There's many of my people that I see like that all of the time, right? Next slide, please. So we got to talk about the DEI because this is many people's attitudes about it. Oh my God. You look at the laws that's just been recently passed in certain states, like no more DEI initiatives. No more DEI initiatives. And I tell you what, if you travel to some of those states, that food is going to be terrible. The service is going to be terrible. All of the culture and the arts and everything else that would actually be in those places is going to be terrible and bland, right? Because here's the issue. Next slide, please. The problem with DEI is not unqualified people getting positions just to check a box. The problem is the white supremacist belief that the white people, especially men, who have historically been in those positions are the only ones who have ever been qualified to be in those positions. That is the problem, that people believe and think that these people who have been the CEOs of these companies and these positions of power that look white, they've only been the ones that's been qualified. That's the problem. Not bringing somebody in to check a box because they're a woman or they're black. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give you the anti-racist playbook, right? So number one, watch the news and social media in rations. Stay informed but not discouraged. There's a quote that I heard from Denzel Washington one day, and he said that if you don't watch the news or read the newspaper, you're misinformed. But if you do watch the news or read the newspaper, you're uninformed. So what are you going to do about it? Right? So you have to engage the news and the media in rations, right? Because if you sit there and watch too much of it, and you're thinking about your capacity to make change and the work that you're doing even in this space, you may feel like it is not doing anything. Because everything that you're going to see on the news is something that is dramatic, and it's going to be something put out there to grab headlines and to get attention, and it's going to be dramatic, right? But this type of work is oftentimes not covered or it's not exposed, and you're not going to see much of that. So the more that you watch this propaganda on television or on social media, the more discouraged you're actually going to be if you're striving to do something positive. So you have to watch it enough to be informed about laws that are being passed and how that's shaping the landscape where we live, but not to the point where you are completely inundated with this negativity. Right? Number 2, learn by asking questions. Research through books, professional development, documentaries, films, music, museums, whatever. You have to take an anthropological approach towards learning about anything, right? A lot of times back in the day when you would have these anthropologists, right, travel to places like Africa or India or some of these other exotic places, some of them, they wouldn't take an anthropological approach. They wouldn't live amongst people. They wouldn't be eating people's food or nothing like that. They would go in the middle of the jungle and set up English tea time. In the middle of the jungle. And they drink an English tea around all of this, vegetation around them, right? But in order to really learn, you have to be committed to being immersed in learning about a culture and about a people, not being like a tourist, because you only see a certain amount of things as a tourist. Make genuine connections, and that leads into that. Make genuine connections with Black people in the interest of building relationships. I think I mentioned this before at one of my presentations, that connecting with a Mexican person isn't going to like their Mexican restaurant on Taco Tuesdays. And you've been there so much that you just know some of the people that work there by their first name. That's not necessarily a genuine connection. A genuine connection is, your children playing together. Maybe inviting them over to your house, or you may be going and visit them, or they may be involved in certain type of activities or something. You have to build relationships and be intentional about that, right? Learn to center Black voices and hold space for our experiences. Be comfortable with being an extra in someone else's movie where they are the entire cast, director, and producers. Just talking about the way that this country was established and it being really white-centered or white supremacist, white people typically are comfortable just being the center of attention, even if people ain't even making you the center of attention. So because of that, white people tend to take up a lot of space, and a lot of times not even being conscious that they're doing that. Because historically, white people have been in a position of being in charge, right? And it's difficult sometimes to step back and say, you know what, I don't really need to be in this space, or to be taking up space, or to give my opinion or anything like that. I was recently a part of a summit about a week or so ago, and it was supposed to be a Black empowerment economic summit. And I get there and I see a bunch of non-Black people in the room, right? Now, if this was a Chinese summit for Chinese people, I would not feel comfortable, or they would not invite me into that room and start telling Chinese people about what they need to do in their businesses, or how they need to do this, or how they need to do that. I wouldn't be allowed to do that. And I wouldn't feel comfortable stepping into a space like that, taking up room. Same thing with a summit if it was a bunch of Jewish people. I wouldn't feel comfortable, and they wouldn't bring me in there telling them how to run their businesses or their institutions, right? Or with women. As a man, it would not be appropriate for them to bring me into a space where it is a summit for women and they're making me the keynote speaker. What? There's been occasions where I've had those type of opportunities and I deferred to a woman and said, no, you need to have a woman in this space to represent what it is that you're establishing as a foundation of what this is actually about. But the problem is, historically, because black people, those of us who have gone through that journey of enslavement, many of us have this paternalistic attitude towards white people and other people. Because historically, whenever we wanted to get together, we had to have a white person present to regulate or to control those type of gatherings. So generationally, many of us to this day still have that attitude that if we are striving to have a summit or we're striving to get together as black people, we need at least one person present that's white. And many people don't realize that they're actually doing that instead of really having the trust and the confidence that we can work things out within ourselves. Does that make sense to everybody? So holding space for people is vitally important in terms of things that you're actively striving to do. Financially invest in black businesses, organizations, and institutions that align with the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, this is also important. Beware of white guilt grifters. When we started to see the development of Black Lives Matter movement, we saw a lot of people who were working in the best interests of black institutions, black businesses, and striving to make sure that there was true equity. But you had other people who came into that and they were grifters. They were utilizing that banner of Black Lives Matter or other different parts that are adjacent to it in order to be grifters and to play on your white guilt. And many of you might have gave money to some of these people, right? And that was the type of transactional relationship that some people actually established. So you have to also be conscious that you have people who deliberately do that. They're not really intentional about working on behalf of black people or to make things equitable or inclusive. They're just here to play on your white guilt, right? Use your privilege to advocate for black people in spaces where you are, starting with your family, community, businesses, organizations, and institutions. So you got to use your ability, right? I was talking to somebody recently, and she was telling me how she was thankful that one of her male friends speaks her name in rooms where there are not women present, right? It sounds cool, but I'm like, yo, if he don't have no authority or no influence, it don't matter what name he's speaking in the room. That could just be an echo off of the wall somewhere. You have to be committed to a person that's able to allocate and dedicate actual resources to you as a woman business owner, or if you started an institution or organization, you have to have somebody that is committed to something that is tangible, not just talk, right? Because anybody could talk with anybody's name in a room. And then last but not least, teach your own people. Y'all got a hard job. You got a very hard job. But one of the ways to approach it is exactly what you've already been doing by making sure that our children have access to the knowledge and the wisdom that you all possess. Because they're going to be our future leaders, right? And these are going to be the ones who change a lot of the things that we see in society right now. A lot of the things that we see that are going on, these are adults making these dumb decisions. Adults. Right? And if we want to change those adults, we have to make sure that our children don't become those adults. Right? So, next slide. So I want to open it up for some questions and answers right now. Yes.
Not directly what you were saying, but I work with some young people, and I have been very frustrated in the last few weeks because they're all white, and they are insulting each other with using the word racist, among other things, and I don't exactly know what, I feel like it's an insult.
What word is it?
Racist.
They're using the word racist?
They're using the word racist against each other where it's not applicable.
Oh, okay.
It's like it's an insult.
Yeah, how old are they?
7th and 8th graders.
Okay.
And you were younger.
Have I encountered that?
Yeah.
Yeah, they use a lot of words that's just like, that is the wrong context. I don't know where you got that from. Yeah. I would say one way to deal with that is to get them to expound on it, get them to elaborate a little bit more on what it is they're saying. Because in that, you might find a jewel. They may have some good insight into what that actually is, right? Sometimes it may not be. It may just be they're throwing a word around and they don't know the basis of it, right? But it really requires you to be comfortable enough to meet them where they are. Because dealing with like younger people, you got to have some thick skin because their generation is a lot different than our generations. I'm Generation X. And I look at millennials and I look at Gen Z and I'm like, oh my God, like I feel like my parents sometimes. But I've had to strive to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? In order to meet them where they are. And then because their attention span is a little bit shorter too than our attention span. I mean, all of us in this audience, we are social media immigrants. We're internet immigrants, right? So we know of a world beyond that. They're social media and internet natives, and that's all that they know. And the social media or the apps themselves deliberately reconfigures not only your attention span, but your cognitive development where it truncates your thought process. And what I mean by that is there are standard texts that is considered normal for certain type of apps that you're on. So if you're on Facebook or something like that, it's not built for you to make a status this long. There's a specific word count for each one because it's hardwiring the attention span. So we're dealing with a generation that has a different attention span. So one thing I kind of learned is you have to learn to double dutch. And when you get an opportunity to say something, you got to jump in and say it and jump right back out because they are not waiting around at all, you know? So in essence, you have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable if you really want to reach them where they actually are, because they're not necessarily going to come to us. We have to find ways to come to them. Yes, sir.
Seems I have a lot of friends up in Canada. What?
You guys feeding the mics to the people online.
Oh, okay. I have a lot of friends in Canada, and they don't seem to have anywhere near the problem that we do in the States with racism. And it would seem that a lot of that has to do with real estate. Is there anything really being done to eliminate the East Side or, being a ghetto? And, besides, the redlining and whatnot, is there any? I just don't see any solutions. If you're all going to live in the East Side and we're going to live out in the second-tier suburbs, lily white.
Yeah.
It's never going to change.
Yeah, traditionally people tend to group in areas where they feel most comfortable. And historically, black people have felt most comfortable being around black people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can definitely see that. But, the banking laws or the banking, the discrimination the banks, portray in schools. Going to Orchard Park High School as compared to, Bennett, there's quite a difference.
Yes.
And, that reflects in college and the rest of your life. So
Yeah.
what's the solution?
Yeah. So before I answer that, let me go back to what you mentioned about Canada. This whole idea of race is basically an American concept. You saw that was more on the background of other different societies in Europe. It was mostly class, but in America, race then class, right? So when you go over to Canada, people over there don't necessarily identify according to their race. They identify according to their nationality. So if I go over to Canada and I see somebody that looks like me, if they say that they're black, I know that came from America. If they say that they're Jamaican or they're Trinidadian or they're Ghanaian or they're Ethiopian, I know that they are defining themselves based upon a national orientation. But once they come across that border in America, you black. And if we don't know what category to put you in, you black. Right? And because of that, you have people who have bought into that type of pseudoscience because there's no real basis of race, period. And unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have adopted that concept. So many of you have adopted this concept of whiteness, and that's what you bear, right? Today is a holiday for Irish Americans. It may be better to define yourself as an Irish American as opposed to a white person, especially in today's day and time, right? If you're from Italy and your ancestors come from there, Italian American. If you're from Germany, German American, because it disassociates you from that stigma of whiteness and a responsibility for those who created this myth of white supremacy, right? In terms of addressing that, there's no real silver bullet, because one of the things that I was mentioning is, as black people, we've confronted issues on all different sides: housing and real estate, health in terms of the medical industry and pharmaceutical industry, education, every aspect of this society or industry. So even if we strive to look at it and say, oh, we just may need better housing, right? That could be one part of the solution, but then you have another part of the issue that's going on over here in terms of health and access to that type of resource. Or now you got to look at schools. Yeah, the houses look nice, but how is the school actually doing here? And then now let's talk about businesses. So there's no real silver bullet. It has to be operating on many different fronts. And the one image that I showed you in terms of black resistance movements of change, these were all people operating in many different forms to address the type of conditions that we have been living in here in America. People addressing it from the cultural angle with music and art. People addressing it from the political angle of running for public office and striving to be a policy maker to direct those resources in the community. You have people doing it from a religious perspective, talking about ethics and morality. So it's coming from all different angles, right? And that's the exact type of approach that is needed, because we're talking about a community, and you have all of those elements in a community. Mm-hmm.
How you doing?
Hey.
Found it very interesting what you had, the whole presentation.
Thank
I think probably could be done even with those kids. They could benefit from learning all just the definitions, just those attitudes we have. Starting off there.
Yeah.
It's funny. I'm Irish, but when I went to Ireland, they made it clear you're an American. Even my close relatives, like I had my grandfather was there. I was looking at his papers when he came over in 1914 today. When he came over, yeah, we're considered Americans. I mean, even when we went over there, they were dirty Yanks, But I think what hit me with this whole thing is we haven't come very far. It's scary, and I think what this political landscape that we're in, I mean, it's like we don't talk directly of the racism and all those things, but it's all covered under. You see the changes with the laws, with everything from the books. The change in the laws, even down south, that they with going back to with the blacks, the minority, that they don't want they want to change the history. They don't want to even talk about the history, And like I say, I grew up, and it's just I see this undercurrent of this. That's why I enjoy this church. It's inclusive. And I grew up in an area that there's this undercurrent, and I think that I hate to say that the last president really fed that, fed the division, and it's scary, and it hasn't changed, and I still see that that I don't know, I'm not explaining it very well, but I just I just wanted I enjoyed the whole
Thank
thing.
you. And as Irish people, you were the black people of Europe. And the Italians, y'all was the black people of Europe too at one point. Jewish people, y'all was the black people of Europe too. But then when it was advantageous to say, we're all white. Yeah, we're all white when it matters. Because there's always instances where it's like, well, you're not white. You're honorary white in this situation. You know what I'm saying? And to your point, that's why it's so important to have spaces like this, especially with children, because I see hope in our children. children, some of the things that you may share with them, they are disgusted. Like, how could somebody do that? As a human being, like, they can't fathom certain things. You know? It's like, I remember going to health class when I was in school, and if there were certain videos that they may have showed me about like sex or something like that, I probably would have been celibate for my entire life. You know what I'm saying? Just being exposed to certain things. And, you know, a lot of our children, like the generation Z and Alpha generation, like these younger ones, they are far more advanced than we ever were. And just spending time with them, you see the hope and the possibility of them changing things. I'll put it this way. I grew up in a generation where I was kind of taught that there was a Wizard in Oz, but yet, you know, I started to see certain things, especially through hip hop music, that started where people were being exposed to the truth, and I started to see like, no, it ain't no Wizard in Oz. You know, I could kind of see behind the curtain a little bit, right? These generations, they know there is no Wizard in Oz. You cannot lie to them. You cannot try to make them believe something that's not true. No. And if you're not genuine and direct with them and being honest and true, they will discard you and not trust anything that you have to say. And I'm thankful to see that type of generation, because they are going to take things into a whole different level. And by investing time with our youth and just sitting around and listening to them, they're not caught up in a lot of the things that we see that are going on. We just have to help prepare them to maintain the integrity and the kindness and the generosity that they have naturally, and to teach them how to navigate a landscape where they're going to come in contact with people who are not as kind, who are not as generous. You know? So investing time around our younger people, that's a cure for a lot of the ills that we have. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, really?
Thank you.
We're way over and nobody's left, so you really hit the spot. I wonder if you had studied the history of the U.S. Constitution to include bits of that. There is, the Southern representatives took over, really, the Constitutional Convention. It's a brilliant document, but they did nothing to protect people of color and women, nothing in the original Constitution. And in fact, I have read a couple of books on the history of the Constitution. They included slavery 28 times in the U.S. Constitution without mentioning the word. Because the founders, even though they were Southerners, many of them, they knew that word would stir up the abolitionists, who were a strong, small group, and they would protest. They wanted to get that Constitution passed. But there are more instances in the Constitution than the 3/5 of a person nonsense that they tried to get in to get the Southerners some kind of equality, but it was only white Southern men, of course, that wanted that. Mm-hmm. But it might be a little leg that you can add to your talk, because from the beginning of the nation, there was this idea that people of color and women were not quite as good.
Yeah.
So that's what we've been trying to overcome for centuries. The amendments that have been added to the Constitution started that, but of course our Supreme Court is taking us right back again. Mm-hmm. And we've got to be educated on what went on with the Constitution and what we can do to get our rights back, because they're being taken away again. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I can give you the names of a couple of books. Librarian that I am, that
explains it.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
Beautiful. There we go. Beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Loved it. I like what you were talking about, like the youth and the kind of the smaller attention span and reaching them. You kind of got to step in, step out. What about for the older generations? And I'm thinking more, I'm not going to throw one parent under the bus, but I have one parent who's very loose-lipped on his views, I guess shared it, on women, on race, on many different things. And I've tuned a deaf ear to him, but deep down inside, I'm saying, I don't think that's right. If I just completely shut down and don't say anything, I'm just letting that go. I have put up barriers to protect my kids from that sort of speech because I don't think that's conducive in our household. But what advice would you have to kind of reach them or kind of open their eyes to seeing that maybe their view is really skewed and they really need to kind of open themselves up?
Wow. Yeah. Ideas like that are kind of like cancer. You know, if you don't strive to address it as soon as possible, it just grows and spreads. And you have to figure out a way to just address it right on. And what comes out after the fact is something that you also have to be comfortable with accepting, because you're really in a position where you're in the same position that people have been in for generations, striving to make a decision in what is in the best interest of true equity, equality, fairness, all of those things. And you have to be courageous enough to just stand there and be like, no, that, and to challenge that. You have to be willing to challenge it. And that's what an upstander is. And that's why I called this presentation Modern Day Upstanders, because you have to be willing to stand up and address a lot of these things. Because if you allow it to live, it just stings somebody else. It's like a snake. And sometimes you got to cut the head of the snake off. And by starting doing it in the family, now it spreads and you develop the confidence to be able to do it in the community and to demonstrate that, because your children is watching this too and how you handle it. And you're teaching them through your actions. And if you don't do nothing, that's what they're learning. That if they can see something like that, that they know is not right or uncomfortable, that they should do the same thing. So you're also standing up to show them how to do it. You know? So that's think about that as well. You're modeling what it means to be an upstander. And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable, but you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
We have a presidential election coming up. Any suggestions on how we should vote?
Oh my God. Oh my God. I don't know.
Seriously,
I don't know.
what would you have any suggestions on what people who are politically minded might want to do for this election?
In any election, I always tell people to make sure that you know who your local and regional officials are, because that is where you have most of your power and influence. I mean, these are people that you could run into at the grocery store, you know? In terms of the presidential, I don't even know. It's kind of like, I don't know. I have no idea. But I always encourage people, know who your local officials are, because they have a direct influence on your quality of life, where you actually live at. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments? All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Our closing video is Get Up, Stand Up by Bob Marley.